In this video, I'm going to use HTML and most specifically SVG to make a pattern based on quilting uh, known as the hole in the barn door pattern. So my original motivation comes from this book on Amish crib quilts. And then I found sort of somebody mapping out this particular pattern, also known as the Churn Dash pattern. And so it's basically broken up into thirds. So you have some triangles and some rectangles and some squares. And so this is a third broken in half. So you have basically thirds and sixths. So easy enough. And then I'm going to try to not just have solid fills, but introduce patterns. And so then I use this YouTube video to explain to me some things about SVG patterns. I'm also going to use SVG image. Okay. So so this was the actual page that I made. So I use this as an SVG. I reproduce that sort of pattern over all shapes. And then I brought in patterns, and then I used those patterns in repetition in sort of in two ways. And again, I'm sort of reproducing this idea, this sort of quilt that you see down here. Now I'm just having the same colors and patterns over and over again. They did something more interesting, but you get the idea. Okay. So let me put that here so I can refer to it when I want to. So here is the Pinterest, and here is that YouTube. I will make this site, put this page up in the link or in the comments. This is my instructions in a comment to remind myself how to save an SVG. I'm going to save this SVG as a separate SVG file and then use that as an image in my last version down here. Okay, so let's get a move on. Okay. So the first is just the sort of basic pattern with the shapes, and it's basically we have triangles, which I'm going to use a polygon for, and rectangles. And then again, we saw that pattern. It was basically thirds and sixths. So I used the basic height of 360, so something that was easy to divide into thirds and sixths. And I made my first set of polygons with three polygons have points, XY points. So the X and the Y are separated by commas, and then you have some sort of space delimiter and another XY pair. And I have four polygons, triangles, and these are the outer ones. So seen here. Then I have what I'm calling the inner triangles, so they only touch the outer edge at a point. That is these darker red ones. Then I have what I'm calling the outer rectangles. So that is the sort of medium mauve, I don't know. And then I have the inner rectangles, which are back to the dark red. And then I finally have the final rectangle or square in the center, which is the sort of lightest pink. Okay, so that is just the basic shapes using SVG, polygon, and rectangle. Now I'm going to bring in the idea of pattern. So I'm making my first pattern. So you make a small thing and then it gets tiled. And so I'm making a 10 by 10 unit that is going to be sort of tiled. I put in that pattern a rectangle that sort of just completely fills it, giving me sort of a background color. And then I put a circle in the middle of it. So if it is 10 by 10, then 5, 5 is the center. And I have this a radius of 4. So it's a little circle sitting within the rectangle, and that gave, and I used that then, so I gave that pattern ID of pattern 1. And then down here, when it comes to actually putting the polygons, here I am using it as the fill, colon URL, parentheses, hashtag pattern 1. So that is me using that pattern I just discussed, this sort of polka dot pattern. I have an array of rectangles with squares in the center. Okay, that was my pattern 1. My pattern 2 is, as it says, a horizontal stripe. I gave it a width of 20 and 10. I could get away with 10 and 10, strictly speaking, but I just wanted to emphasize to myself, more or less, that it was a horizontal, so I made it the unit wider. And so I had a background rectangle, and then I had a second rectangle of height 5. So that was that it was the full width, but only half the height. So that made that sort of horizontal stripe. I make a vertical stripe in the same way, except that the height is full, but the width is half of my 10. And so then that makes it a vertical stripe. And so we can see that here, my two of my, what I'm calling the inner rectangles, are horizontal stripes and 2 are vertical stripes. Then I come to my diagonals. So I'm making another pattern, pattern 4. I'm making my unit, I've gone up to 14 instead of 10. I am sort of working with a sort of right isosceles triangle here. And so like a square root of 2 comes into the math of all this. And so comparing my 10 by 10 unit and sort of rotating it and bringing in that square root of 2 that comes along with that. Square root of 2 is 1.414. I just went with 1.4 and multiplied it by the 10. That's where my crazy 14 comes from. And I put my background color in. I'm making a line in this case that goes from the upper left 0, 0 to the lower right 14, 14. And then I want to show what I have 2 little polygons, which are triangles again. I'm going to give them a different color so that you can see what they are doing. So now you can see the very bright red here, and let me amp it up a bit. Even more so. So within the sort of little square unit, I have this line, this horizontal line, but it's sort of cut off, and I wanted to fill in sort of what was missing in the lines. And so I needed these little triangles to make it a solid line without breaking it up like that. So that's why the little circles. That's the thing that you often do with a pattern, is, fill in that extra little bit that gets missed when it's tiled. So let me put that back to 4, 4. Save. And there we are. I don't need to be quite so gargantuan. Okay. So that was my diagonal stripes, and I have diagonals in sort of both directions. And then we can see that. So here, here's one kind of diagonal. Here's the other kind of diagonal. Then I have a checkerboard pattern. So I made this pattern larger. Instead of 10 by 10, I went for 20 by 20. And I have an overall filling rectangle. That's the background color. And then within that, I have 2 little squares. One half the width and half the height. So a quarter of the unit all together, starting at 0, 0, and then another one starting at 10, 10. So that is the checkerboard pattern. So, and then finally, I have my second polka dot pattern. This one, again, I'm making that larger 14 by 14 size. I have the overall rectangle filling it with color. I have a center circle, so 14, 14, 7, 7. This is a center circle. And then I have four other circles that are sort of at the corners. And they only a quarter of this circle, of each of these circles, survive within the pattern because they have to be within the 14 by 14 square. And there's one at 0, 0, 0, 14, 14, 14, and 14, 0. So all the corners. And that's giving this. So whereas this first polka dot pattern, there was a single circle, and then when it got tiled, there was this sort of square array of circles. Here with that sort of something in the corners, I get a sort of staggered, I'll call it a staggered polka dot. Okay. And then I just reproduced the pattern again with those fills. And so that made this. Okay. So now where are we? Okay. So now I'm going to make that whole unit a pattern. And then I'm going to have, so there will be these little patterns. Then I'm going to make this whole big thing a pattern and repeat it. So now we have this starting with line 130 here. I have this big pattern I'm calling pat hole. It's the hole in the barn door pattern. And then I have these little patterns. I gave them above it might have been called pattern 1. Here I'm just calling it pat 1 because, you know, two things shouldn't have the same ID. So I have these little patterns and I make this whole shape, and then this whole big shape is going to be itself a pattern. So let's collapse that. So all of this is what we just talked about above. And then I want to use that, this thing that's now a pattern. So I'm going to fill this whole thing. This is much larger, 1080 by 1440. And I'm going to fill that in with this pattern hole. And so that gave this sort of, I'm going to call it the quilt of that pattern. So there is my first quilt with it, which is sort of patterns within patterns. And then I took a different approach on the bottom. I took this first pattern up here, and I sort of go to inspect the page, and I find that SVG, it's the second one here. And then you can copy, and under a lot of things in a copy, you want copy outer HTML, and then you can paste it into like a text file and save that text file as an SVG and change two attributes. And so I went through that, and those directions are here. And so I made an SVG, which is just that unit, that one unit, this unit. Okay. And now I can use that external SVG file so there it is. I called it whole unit SVG. And then I'm using that in an image tag within a larger SVG. And in this one, I'm not using it as a pattern. I'm using it as an image that I can place. And so I don't have to place them exactly next to each other. And so I gave myself, I made it all, I gave it a black background, and then I sort of placed these images and gave myself some border between, some space between the patterns. And that was sort of matching to some extent this original quilt that was my inspiration. Okay, so again, so I used SVG, I used polygon, I used rectangle, I used pattern. Within the pattern, I showed two kinds of polka dot, a checkerboard pattern, a stripe, horizontal and vertical stripe, and diagonal of two kinds of stripe. I worked with working with a sort of pattern within pattern to sort of make my first version of a quilt. And then I also saved a pattern as an external SVG and brought it back in as an image tag within SVG. Okay, that's what I wanted to show you in this one. Thanks for your attention.